All right. Yeah, we might go ahead and make a start. Thanks everybody for coming to this debut of my new book, Early Byzantine Apocalyptic Discourses, Coping with the Crises of the 6th and 7th Centuries. Very descriptive title. Today we're going to have essentially a celebration that has finally come to pass. We'll begin with our special guest Bronwyn Neal, who will offer a bit of a response / a few words about the book and other things, and then I'll give a bit of an overview and sort of try to contextualize this work as part of my larger research career, and then we can have a Q&A discussion, and I've brought a few finger foods here as well. So without any further ado, I might introduce Professor Bronwyn Neal from Macquarie University, who will say a few words.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here at University of Newcastle and to support Ryan in the launch of this much-awaited book. I think Ryan started this project in 2014, in a way, when he first came to Australia to do his doctorate with me and others at Australian Catholic University, and then I made him decamp to Macquarie in 2017, and he finished in 2019. So he's been very busy working. As you would know, Ryan is a hard worker and he's involved in a lot of stuff, both nationally and locally. So I think it's been a real asset to history here at UON. So this book, anybody here know anything about apocalyptic literature? Have you watched a movie that you might consider apocalyptic? The Book of Eli, you mentioned 2012. Mm-hmm. Any others? There's stacks at the moment. Yeah, anything that ends with nuclear holocaust or giant plagues, epidemics, giant floods, tsunamis, earthquakes. Did I miss anything? End of the world scenarios, basically. So although it has a strong religious bent, it also existed in ancient Rome in a non-religious context, which is kind of interesting. But the religious framework came through Judaism to Christianity and then to Islam, and the common feature is it involves God's hand in history, spotting God's providential hand. So even when things are going wrong, and the biggest crises are hitting the Byzantine Empire, which is the Persian Wars, the Arab invasions, the rise of Islam in the 6th and 7th centuries. They were the big disasters for Byzantium. They could interpret those as God trying to bring them back onto the right path. So these days we tend to think of apocalyptic literature as being really negative, as having a pessimistic view of the world. It's going to end soon through climate change or nuclear disaster, accidents or deliberately, as you know, we have this kind of rhetoric going on every time there's an uprising in the Middle East. It comes to the fore again. But for the Byzantines, Ryan argues that more than a pessimistic kind of fatalistic, the end of the world is upon us and there's nothing we can do, this was a means of coping with crises because you read them as God punishing you for something, which still meant that you were God's people, right? So you're still in the hand of God, but God's whacking you down because of heresy, because of, for instance, the Emperor Heraclius married his niece. His second wife was his niece, so he was accused of incest. Then she died in mysterious circumstances. She was probably poisoned and her son died, so that kind of wiped out that dynastic line, but nevertheless his other sons and grandsons were able to continue on where he'd left off. So if there were ups and downs, let's say, for the Byzantine Empire in the 6th and 7th century. One of the ups was Heraclius reclaiming the true cross. He went to the Persian capital of Ctesiphon and picked up what he alleged was the true cross of Jesus' crucifixion and brought it back to Jerusalem. Bits of it ended up all over the world. So this kind of thinking that Christianity would one day prevail was very much part of Byzantine apocalyptic. And then we have Islamic apocalyptic, which interprets the same events from a very different lens. So when the Arab forces went down, that was a sign of Allah punishing them. So you kind of can read the same events from very different perspectives depending on your own faith. So yeah, that's what this book is about, and it's very topical, obviously, at the moment with the Middle East blowing up around us. And it's another thing that the book does is argue that apocalyptic literature is not just silly nonsense for entertainment, as you mentioned. She likes apocalyptic because it's entertaining. But this was really a serious religious discourse that brought hope to people that there would be a final saviour, a deliverer. The Romans called it the Holy Roman Emperor. He would then hand over to the Antichrist, and the Antichrist would eventually see to Jesus and the second coming and the last judgment, and then there'd be a new heaven on earth and a new Jerusalem. So they're very interesting ideas, and they're still with us in many forms. So, you know, that big debate about whether the American consulate should be in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. It was a religious lobby pushing, the evangelical religious lobby, and they are bankrolling Trump. You know, every time he does something in the Middle East, there's evangelical money rolling in. So it's very interesting to me, but it's not the kind of history we do in Australia very much. So Ryan's a bit of a pioneering spirit in this area, I think, and probably no coincidence that you're American, Ryan. Mm-hmm. So Ryan shows that the promises of a last Roman emperor and a Messiah who would deliver the Byzantines from their present troubles was a way of making sense of the chaos and offered comfort to its readers and hearers. So it's a little bit counterintuitive, isn't it? You're reading about disasters, but at the end of the tunnel, there's a light showing, which will be God delivering someone through some great human leader, or the Mahdi in some Muslim denominations. This is Ryan's first monograph and his second book. He co-edited a volume with Daniel Gino from Macquarie University on dissidence and persecution in Byzantine society, from Constantine the Great to Michael Psellos, so from the 4th century to the 10th. And so you can see that that covers this period, and that there's similar themes of dissidence and persecution. And it's only one of Ryan's significant achievements from last year. He also led study tours to Greece and Rome, and I had a student go from Macquarie, and she just said it was the best time. And Ryan had her giving lectures about Roman baths, and they went to all sorts of interesting places, and I think every student there really benefited. And he's also been chief investigator on a new discovery project with me and 2 others from ANU and Macquarie. And he's become the deacon of the Serbian Church, a deacon of the Serbian Church in Broadmeadow. So that's an ordination that kind of gets visited upon you when you least expect it. So another responsibility he took on last year. He ran a workshop on our discovery project on mass media in the Roman Empire here at Newcastle, and a conference of the Australasian Association for Byzantine Studies. And we decided, whether rightly or wrongly, to run them back-to-back. So that was 2 weeks of extreme hard work for Ryan and helpers like Nicole here. He's currently editing that volume for publication, aren't you, Ryan? Yeah, that's right. Yeah. His achievements have been many, and all the more remarkable for having arrived here in Australia only 12 years ago. And he and his wife Janet also became Australian citizens last year, so we have them for keeps now. His contribution to the university and more broadly to Byzantine studies in Australia, he's the vice president of that Australasian Association, has been significant, and I very much look forward to seeing what you do next. His mentoring of the next generations, including Nicole and Connie and others, shows that he's keen to pay it forward. I'm really proud of Ryan and his achievements, and very glad that he and Janet have made Newcastle their home, as I'm sure you are, and I hope you will join me in congratulating him on this wonderful publication.
Thank you, Bronwyn, for that. A little bit chuffed, but appreciate that. Yeah, so, thanks for that. Now just my bit. I want to, spend the next just few minutes offering a few thank yous and contextualizing the work here. So indeed, it's kind of interesting, this isn't the sort of work you want to become timely, but I guess it's interesting that it is. My work deals with a empire that is, prides itself as God's country, as God's nation, and feels it's facing an existential threat in Persia, and then eventually by Muslim invaders. So there's a lot of, and using that sort of rhetoric of messianism and final conquest to rouse the population and troops, to act on those actions and those motivations. So it's and also this rhetoric of apocalypticism and an apocalyptic, providential outcome in the future that everybody's striving for and predicting will rise out of this. It's a bit uncanny at times with our own times. But this, had its genesis at the University of Kentucky in a seminar paper of all things. I was working on a master's thesis on another 7th century topic on Maximus the Confessor in a document that it was attributed to him that I say wasn't, but that's another story. And so I needed to write on something different. So I worked on a letter by Maximus the Confessor that at the very end goes into he's a fairly, if you've read Maximus, which only one of you probably has in the room, he's a intellectual. He's a very straightforward, grounded individual. I mean, he's prone to rhetoric at times, but it's not the sort of person you would expect to go on to a rant about how imperial policy is going to bring about the end of times and, the return of Christ and all these sort of dire predictions. I ended up arguing that, that chunk didn't belong to that letter. It was from a different document, but it put me onto this idea of apocalyptic in random sort of spaces where you wouldn't expect it. When we think of apocalypticism, which I'm sure all of us do at some point, right? Especially these days. You probably think of, maybe the book of Revelation or similar vision tales of distant futures, of end times, of chaos and crisis and things like this, a sort of specialized genre. I was struck by the fact that, based on this letter, and then I went and did future investigations on how frequent you found this in everyday mundane literature, from letters to, historiography, saints' lives, things, court poetry, it might be fleeting instances, but you have, this sort of apocalyptic rhetoric permeating literature, not just the big vision tales, which did exist. The most famous one is the Apocalypse of Pseudo Methodius, which came out of this time, which was translated into Latin and quickly distributed across the Western Europe, and really held the imagination of Europeans. But that was just sort of the exemplar of this larger apocalyptic movement. And I got very curious about that and started to dig into it, and really traced it to an early 6th century millenarian movement that happened, of all things, because of the year 6000, according to the creation of the world, according to early Jewish and Christian rendering, right? This Y6K problem that assumed that Christ would come at the year 6000, and so there's this sort of apocalyptic fervor that rose up, and then just kind of like so many in our own time, just fizzled out. But it set a precedent for responding to crises. Then you have the plague of Justinian, and then the invasion, the Persian conflicts, and then later the Islamic invasions. And so I sort of looked at those examples and how, indeed, apocalyptic was used to cope with crises, and often, providing this message of hope that, yes, things are bad, but things will get better. Or in the most extreme cases, don't worry, it's going to get worse. But, right now it's not so bad. But always, more often than not, a message of hope, not so much that the end is nigh, that this is a temporary roadblock. And you see this in Jewish responses as well to persecution by the Heraclean dynasty. You see this in Christian responses, and some would argue in 7th century early Islamic literature, as well as an apocalyptic movement. So that's the gist of the book, and we can talk about some details. But before I do that, I meant to do this first. I wanted to offer some sincere thanks. So Bronwyn, of course, has seen me through this whole PhD process. I wouldn't be here without her and her patronage. So to return the praise, it's my pleasure to do that. And I thank you very much for everything you've done for me. I thank David Olster from the University of Kentucky, who sort of put me onto this early document and begrudgingly let me go and to Australia rather than, despite him wanting me to stay and finish my PhD there. Ultimately, he saw the benefits of traveling abroad and the rich relationships I could build over here. And we actually got him to come in 2019 to do a keynote at a Byzantine conference. So, he benefited from that in the end anyway. Pauline Allen from ACU as well was at the beginning stages of the project. But in addition to that, I have, so many colleagues to thank. My various fellow traveling postgrads at the time from ACU and Macquarie who have done, wonderful things in their own right. Also, the various universities along the way I've worked at, from Macquarie to UQ to ANU, and then finally here, and my wonderful colleagues, many of whom are, or at least two of whom are in the room, three of whom are in the room. And it's just been wonderful to have the support and encouragement and collegial atmosphere at this university. It's not always present. Despite our small size, we have a lot fewer egos, which is lovely. I also thank the University of Newcastle for providing me with a New Start grant, which helped finally get this book over the line. I would never complain. I'm very fortunate for my career, but it has involved a lot of moving and a lot of chaos, a lot of extra labor that has prevented me from doing research and getting this across the line like I should have. Plus a lot of procrastination, let's be honest. But circumstances did prevent me from finishing a little bit sooner than I would have liked to. That New Start grant helped out significantly. Various scholarships along the way from ACU and then at Macquarie as well as an AHA, Australian Historical Association, copyright mentorship grant, which unfortunately I don't think they offer, at least right now, but even the AHA was very generous and that helped me get across the line earlier on, as well as a Macquarie Junior Fellowship, which allowed me to go to Dumbarton Oaks, the big Byzantine research library in Washington, D.C., which helped me, essentially collect everything to finish my PhD thesis that would become my book. So it's been, I'm finally happy to be finished with this. It's been a labor of love and a labor of anxiety and frustration, but here it is. And that's, it's unreal to actually hold it in my hands. There's times that I didn't think it would come to that we would get across that line. But with everybody's support and, but also I almost forgot the most important person, my wife, Janet, if she ever listens to this. If it weren't for her long-suffering willingness to move across the country, across the world, and to, follow my dreams, with, the benefit of traveling and tagging along on my journeys, I wouldn't be here. So she deserves the most gratitude. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for showing up. And I'm happy to discuss, elements of the book. We have examples here you can look at. I have flyers from Brill.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, are there any questions? Anything I can? Yes.
Yeah, maybe. So I guess two questions. First question is, you've spoken about the historical influence of these different kinds of eschatological discourses coming from the different religious communities. But were the people reading the contemporary discourses of the different religious groups? So were Christians of the 6th and 7th centuries reading the writings of Jews and Muslims of the 6th and 7th centuries and vice versa? And the other thing I was wondering about is, are they imagining, or at least for the Byzantine Christians, are they imagining Constantinople as the new Jerusalem? And if so, how does that play into Constantinople as also being the new Rome?
Excellent questions, yes. And I do address most of those things at various points in the book. And I think I can remember them on the top of my head, too. As far as, where they see themselves and their sort of placement and, sort of emplotment into history. So I argue that the Byzantines, or the Romans, as they would prefer to be called, are really tapping into Christian and classical narratives and placing themselves in those narratives. So, Heraclius is conveniently named, right? He makes a really good new Heracles, or Hercules in the Roman guys. And in fact, one of the poets, George of Pisidia, who's one of his, great panegyrists, essentially says, you're a new and greater Heracles, Heracles only strangled a lion and slew a boar. You saved the city. You brought back the empire from the dead. He's descended into Hades and saved a woman. You saved the empire, right? Even though he hadn't done so yet, it's sort of a promise of things to come. But you also have him, as a new David, as a new Daniel in the lion's den. The Persians become very much part of that. With Khosroes II being the new Nebuchadnezzar. And things like this, bringing into that Old Testament Hebrew Bible tradition as well. So, and the Jews, for their part, are doing this too. There's the Sefer Zerubbabel, which is a famous apocalypse written in Hebrew at the time. That's attributed to Zerubbabel, the rebuilder of the walls of Jerusalem after the exile, and he receives this vision of things to come. And like a lot of these apocalypses, they begin with history that's already passed, and then they stop at history to come, right at the contemporary events. And it talks about Heraclius as a sort of anti-messianic figure who is persecuting the Jews now, but eventually the Messiah will rise up and slay and liberate the Jews. So there's a lot of that sort of fervor taking place on both Christian and in Jewish literature as well. And some scholars like Stephen Shoemaker would argue that the early Islamic Muhammad's early movement was also tapping into similar traditions about a last king of the Greeks who would rise up, and that he was that last king. And some would argue that the building of the Dome of the Rock was actually an attempt to rebuild the Second Temple, based on its location, that that they saw themselves as fulfilling that prophecy. So everybody, all three major world religions at the time, even the nascent Islam, are tapping into similar sorts of narratives. As far as Jerusalem, or as far as Constantinople as the New Jerusalem, there's definitely, I guess you could say, hints towards that, or it's attempts to, display that. When Heraclius rescues the cross from Ctesiphon, it's worth noting, Persia, the Sasanians had conquered Jerusalem, and so first, Jerusalem was liberated, then Heraclius went and retrieved the cross, which had been taken as sort of a trophy of war, right? So he makes a very, well, this is back to Jerusalem, so it's not even Constantinople. But he does make a very public, display of returning the cross to Jerusalem, almost in a triumphal return, mimicking Christ's triumphal entry. But also, so tapping into those messianic views without outright saying it, but there's a lot of discourse suggesting that, while Heraclius isn't the Messiah, he is a divinely raised deliverer who will, literally restore the world, right? He'll make Rome great again, as it were. But yeah, so as far as the New Jerusalem, that plays heavily into the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, as well as the Sefer Zerubbabel. So in the Sefer Zerubbabel, Jerusalem itself will be restored and rebuilt and expanded. In the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, if I'm correct, Christ actually, when the final reign is handed over, when the last king of the Greeks finally hands over the reins to Christ, or once he takes over, he actually restores in the actual Jerusalem, I believe is where he reigns from. It's been a while. I could be mistaken there, but I think so. So I don't think Constantinople is definitely, God's city. It's the new Rome, but I don't think it's, now that I'm thinking about it, I don't think it's really the New Jerusalem per se. Now that I'm thinking it through.
That would be a bit sacrilegious.
Yeah. I mean, the Christians are definitely, Verus Israel. They're the new Israel. And that rhetoric is used, to force Jews to be baptized, for example. But Jerusalem is Jerusalem. It's still the heavenly city.
And I guess looking forwards, if you think about the idea of say, Moscow as the new
As a third
Constantinople, as a third Rome. It's always the third Rome and not the third Jerusalem.
Yeah, I think at least among Christian peoples, and Jerusalem is, the heavenly Jerusalem.
Absolutely, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. Yeah, John.
That point about how you view them positively or negatively, these apocalyptic things, really depends on which end of it you're in. I mean, at the moment, we've got wars blowing up all over the place because this evangelical idea that somehow if, all these prophecies come true, then a great rapture will occur and they'll all go to heaven. So from the internals of this thing, they're probably enjoying the way the world is going at the moment. From the external, we're seeing it with horror. I mean, you think about the other thing that it's close to my heart is that event that happened in England with regards to that supernova that in Cassiopeia that created a crucifix in the sky in 1572 and caused the whole religious upheavals, the murders, because they thought that was God impressing, his stamp on the heavens. Yeah. Again, I mean, there would have been people that would have been excited about God coming back, but everyone who was getting the slaughtering would have been. How do you differentiate those two points?
Yeah, well, I should have said this at the beginning. At the core of this is the question I was trying to answer essentially is, the Byzantines, Romans saw themselves as God's chosen people, right? So how does that attitude and self-understanding endure massive defeat, right? How do you justify that? How do you cross that, cross that T or whatever the phrase might be? So first, with the Zoroastrian Persians, and then later the, Islam, which they weren't entirely sure what it was at the beginning. It was seen as this sort of, new thing that was risen up literally against the Christians. So they understand the current crises, and these are written in the midst of crisis, right? These are, the crisis is still very much going on. They're understanding it as that sort of temporary divine chastisement. So, a lot of these sermons and a lot of these writings are talking about, like these are the sins of the Christians. If we simply stop from that, God will restore our proper place. He will turn the sword of the enemy against itself, and things will be made right. So it's not, we're not looking at a triumph. It sees triumph in the future. So it's sort of explaining, God hasn't abandoned us, right? If victory is evidence of God's favor, that doesn't necessarily mean the defeat is evidence of God's disfavor or abandonment. So in this case, it's actually, it's towards an end to get us back to where we need to be. But yeah, as far as, modern apocalyptic movements and dispensationalism and these sort of 200-year-old evangelical theologies, it's a whole different sort of take on things that would have been completely foreign to this group. So nobody would be rejoicing necessarily. Yeah, there's not really rejoicing in the suffering itself, but rejoicing in the fact that, if we just hang on, if we just hold out, and if we turn our ways around, we can actually turn this thing around, right? I think that there's a lot of similarity to the attitude. I have to imagine at least there's a lot of similarity to the attitudes of these writers and preachers of the time, as there are to, climate change, activists, right? You see the crisis around you is entirely preventable, and you see the cure right in front of you, but nobody will embrace it, right? So for us, if we just simply cut back on fossil fuel consumption, if we, look after our environment, it might be almost too late, but it's not yet. If we just do that, but nobody listens, right? So for people of this time, it's the same sort of thing. Look, the punishment's all around you, but yet you continue to sin. You continue to, not go to church. You continue to have, affairs and unnatural sex and all these various bizarre things they come up with. I think there's a similar exacerbation that is probably present. So very relatable.
And no rapture.
Yes, no, there's no idea of a rapture or a second or third coming for that matter, great tribulation. This is, life is the great tribulation, right? Yeah. Yeah, Nicole.
I've been wondering for a bit now, was there a particular I don't know, did particular crises have a relationship to a particular undesirable person or behavior? So like we've got plagues because our empress used to be a prostitute, or we've got invasion happening because, I don't know, we've got too many Jews and we need to go and baptize them, or was there sort of correlation that way?
I think in the case of the Justinianic plague, he did have a convenient scapegoat with Justinian to blame his, depending on the author, right? Especially if you're, a minority Christian or a pagan, in air quotes there, you could sort of see him as a fault line. The Jews don't really get blamed for the punishment; they get blamed as collaborators with the Persians. So that's what spurs on the forced baptism of decree by Heraclius. So, and there does seem to be evidence that when the Persians initially conquered Jerusalem, they allowed the Jews to come in and do rituals on the Temple Mount. So that was quickly rescinded, but there does seem to have been some restoration of autonomy very briefly. So, and that just angered the Christian emperor once he was able to get power back. He took out it was a political opposition there. The actual apocalyptic accusations are usually generic sins or, heresy to some extent, division, things like this. A lot of sexual sins, a lot of laundry lists of debaucheries that are probably not proper to mention over the recordings here. And also some bizarre things like eating kittens. That's one of my favorite ones. Yeah. It's literally, in the Apocalypse of Suda Methodius, that's one of the things that the unclean peoples are doing. But yeah. So no, to answer your question, aside from Justinian, who's sort of I think a focal point because of, just how larger than life he is. There's not really a particular sin that leads to particular punishments.
Just explain the coins on the cover.
Yeah, so these are coins of the Heraclian dynasty. We have Heraclius with the mustache there and his two sons. One is cut off there on the obverse, and then on the reverse we have the cross. Of course, it's interesting when once large swaths of the Byzantine territories were under Islamic control, they kept this style of coinage, including the emperor's effigies, but on the obverse they replaced the cross with a pillar. So that's how you can tell they were trying to maintain continuity of currency and sort of comfort in that territory, but they couldn't bring themselves to put a cross on the coin. So that's how you can tell early Islamic coinage from the late 7th century versus genuine Byzantine coinage.
So, like on the peripheries of Byzantine Empire, like one of the very productive and prolific writers were money kings. Like money, because of himself and like the fate of the money, like has a lot of his disciples and people were writing about like one way or another apocalyptic event that happened. Have you touched upon that bit in your work?
Honestly, I have not. That's an area that could use some expansion. Aside from seeing, Manichaeanism used as a generic catch-all heresy in a lot of the accusations, but actual primary sources from Manichaeans, I haven't had a chance to look at. So yeah, that'd be an interesting point of potential collaboration.
Yeah, thank you for not touching it there.
Yes. It's yours, please. I'm trying to do earlier things now, but this topic keeps sucking me back in. But as I think PhD projects tend to do, always want to move on to the next thing. There's always something that sort of brings you in.
Brian's probably outside of the area, but you mentioned that the Persians Jews were briefly allowed to carry out rituals again. Do you happen to know whether they're following at that point they're basically going, okay, we'll carry out rabbinical practices on the Temple Mount, or are they attempting to restore animal sacrifice and things like that?
I think it's the latter. Yeah, I think they were, allowing sort of preliminary restoration I mean, it's very speculative because the project, was ended quite quickly, but
Sure.
there's a lot of speculation that they were planning to allow the rebuilding of the temple and the restoration of temple rituals and things of that nature. So, yeah. So it's, it's a very fascinating time. And, there's sort of an uptick of Jewish messianism at the same time and, apocalyptic. And there's a really interesting document. Speaking of forced baptisms and all this, there's a document called "The Doctrina of Jacob the Newly Baptized," which is from the perspective of a forcefully baptized Jew. But he goes into such great detail and uses a lot of Jewish idiom that we know from other sources that would have been that weren't available in Greek. That it's actually potentially created by an actual forcefully baptized Jew. So he uses a number of insults that are like mamzer, which is sort of like bastard or something like that, which you would never say in Greek. He uses that to refer to the Jews as the true mamzer versus the Christians who are Veris Israel, true Israel. So, but he also includes some of these veiled critiques of Heraclius that are only found in Hebrew texts. So it's a really interesting sort of obscure dialogue. There's lots of adverse Judaist stuff coming out from that period, but this is particularly interesting, very controversial as well.